Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. This book was originally published in 2004, and it is the first book by Marilynne Robinson that I've read and chatted here on my channel, and I'm really glad to have gotten to this because it's literally been on my reading list for years and years. Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. So this is some contemplative fiction. So we don't have to concern ourselves too much with spoilers with this particular chat. It is really all about just sort of reflection by our main character, the Reverend John Ames, who has learned that he is dying, and he writes letters. He's writing like letters to his young son at this point in the book. And so that's basically what the book is these series of letters. So there will be a letter about a particular day, the events of one particular day, or sometimes he talks about the past as well. Also in the book, eventually, his best friend also lives in this town of Gilead, Iowa, and the time is 1956, I think is what it said at the beginning of the book. But his best friend has family, and he sort of has a prodigal son that's been away for a long time, and it sort of leads this mysterious life, and he returns back into town, and the Reverend then needs to address some, readjust his thinking about this son who he feels has caused his father quite a bit of unhappiness in his life. But yeah, so John Ames, I mentioned, is dying. So he was married when he was earlier on, when he was younger, but his wife had died, and I think he also had a child at that point that died. And then he remarried much later in life. So he's like 76 years old because he married a much younger woman, a woman who started coming to his congregation. He is a Congregationalist reverend, and he comes from a family of Congregationalist reverends. And so going back to his grandfather, who had been in the Civil War and had been an ardent abolitionist, and then his father also was a Congregationalist minister, and then he also was. So through these letters to his son, we get this sort of view of American history from the time of shortly before the Civil War all the way up until 1956. So how I thought I would approach this chat, since the book is rather contemplative, it's all about feelings and moods and like life observations. I selected some quotes from the book that I thought would be really sort of interesting to go over because they really illustrate sort of what the tone of the book is, as well as what some of these really interesting observations that the Reverend has about life and what it means to be human and stuff like that. So let's get to it. All right, the first quote is so sometimes in the book, the letters will have some observation that he notices in this small town that day. And here he's talking about these two young fellows he saw on the street. And he says, "I passed two young fellows on the street the other day. I know who they are. They work at the garage. They're not church-going, either one of them. Just decent, rascally young fellows who have to be joking all the time. And there they were, propped against the garage wall in the sunshine, lighting up their cigarettes. They're always so black with grease and so strong with gasoline, I don't know why they don't catch fire themselves. They were passing remarks back and forth the way they do and laughing that wicked way they have, and it seemed beautiful to me." I love that. I think it's such a beautiful little story drawn right there in that one paragraph. This sort of painting with words. I can really just sort of feel this being out in this small town and seeing these two guys leaned up against the garage telling each other something, some kind of story, and laughing. And yeah, it seemed beautiful to him. I think that's so cool. Yeah, so then, as I mentioned, there's observations about life. And so part of that is how he's set apart as being, since he's a reverend, he's a minister. So people in town sort of treat him a little bit different sometimes. And he says, That's the strangest thing about this life, about being in the ministry. People change the subject when they see you coming. And then sometimes those very same people come into your study and tell you the most remarkable things. There's a lot under the surface of life. Everyone knows that. A lot of malice and dread and guilt and so much loneliness where you wouldn't really expect to find it either. So, he sees, because people come to him and tell them the details sometimes of their lives. And so he has sort of seen and heard many things over the course of his long career. And he approaches these people with love and understanding throughout the book. And I just think he's such a well-drawn, compassionate character that it's just really wonderful. So he talks about all the writing. So he has a bunch of sermons that have been in boxes, and he thinks that nobody will be interested in them. And he's talking about these letters that he's writing. He says, "For me, writing has always felt like praying, even when I wasn't writing prayers, as I was often enough. You feel that you are with someone. I feel I am with you now, whatever that can mean, considering that you're only a little fellow now, and when you're a man, you might find these letters of no interest, or they might never reach you for any number of reasons." So this sort of transience of life and uncertainty of life, he's not even sure his son will ever even get these letters, because he goes through like what different things could happen to destroy the letters before his son had a chance to grow up, because the letters are this sort of fragile thing. Really, they're paper, written paper. At this point, it's 1956. And then also, his son may grow up. He doesn't know how his son is going to grow up. And so his son may have no interest in them whatsoever and never actually even read them. Or his son might not live to grow up. So that sort of uncertainty is, he actually addresses this a number of times throughout the book. Nevertheless, though, he writes these letters with an immense amount of love. And I think that's so cool. So he talks about his grandfather. His father was also a Christian Congregationalist minister, and his grandfather, as I mentioned, although they were very quite different. The grandfather was a abolitionist, so very sort of militant, thinking that the Christian responsibility was to fight the war, with violence, to abolish slavery. But the old grandfather had a lot of wisdom, nevertheless, and it was just different than it was a different time, and I'll talk more about that. I have a quote about that coming up. But one of the sayings of the grandfather was he actually ended up in the war losing his right eye. And his comment about losing his right eye was, "I am confident that I will find a great blessing in it." So that sort of became a family motto. I am confident that I will find great blessing in it. I think that's not a bad motto to have, because if you frame your life that way, looking for the blessing, you'll find it. As I mentioned, the grandfather had been a very strict abolitionist. As a matter of fact, he had moved from Maine. He had this vision of Jesus in chains, slavery chains, and he felt it was his calling to go to Kansas. This is before the war, when they were deciding if Kansas was going to be a free state or a slavery state. And he decided it was his calling to go to Kansas. And so he felt he needed to be useful in the cause of abolition. And there's a quote that says, "To be useful," this is from one of the letters, "to be useful was the best thing the old men ever hoped for themselves, and to be aimless was their worst fear. I have a lot of respect for that view." So I talked about the sort of the impermanence of life, and one thing is his own life, because he reflects on his own upcoming death. And he says, "I feel sometimes as if I were a child who opens its eyes in the world once and sees amazing things it will never know any names for, and then has to close its eyes again. I know this is all mere apparition compared to what awaits us, but it is only lovelier for that. There is a human beauty in it." He just sees the beauty in being human, being alive, even with all of our frailties, all of our shortcomings, all of our faults, and all the hurts we cause others as well as to ourselves. He has this huge compassion for it. He writes one, and I mentioned also earlier how he will observe something on a particular day and he'll write that down. And he says, "The moon looks wonderful in this warm evening light. just as a candle flame looks beautiful in the light of morning, light within light. And then he goes on to say, it seems to me to be a metaphor for the human soul, the singular light within the great general light of existence. Or it seems like poetry within language, perhaps wisdom within experience, or marriage within friendship and love. I think that's so cool and beautiful. I mentioned earlier that how he talks about how times change and things change. He says, I have thought about that very often, how the times change, and the same words that carry a good many people into the howling wilderness in one generation are irksome or meaningless in the next. And this quote comes after an incident in the book where he's remembering this incident where his grandfather gave a speech, and he gave this sort of fiery abolitionist activist sort of speech and to this crowd, and times had changed at this point, and so the crowd didn't really know what to do with that. So he reflects on it that way. Finally, I'll close this chat with this sort of comment on kind of our current time as well. I feel he's talking about his wife. So his wife had not grown up being religious or not in the Congregationalist church, and so she always sort of was an outsider to the church crowd of the reverend, and so she tried to like learn different, learn the religion basically. And some of the ladies of the church, sort of took it upon themselves to teach her. And he says two or three of the ladies had pronounced views on points of doctrine, particularly sin and damnation, which they never learned from me. I blame the radio for sowing a good deal of confusion where theology is concerned. And television is worse. You can spend 40 years teaching people to be awake to the fact of mystery, and then some fellow with no more theological sense than a jackrabbit gets himself a radio ministry, and all your work is forgotten. I do wonder where it will end. Well, we can kind of see this book takes place in 1956. Where it has ended up so far is the world of the internet, right? Where this sort of chance for the spread of misinformation has multiplied exponentially. And I thought that was really interesting and really, really, really cool. Okay, I think I will leave this chat here. I did love this. I love the Reverend. He does speak in sort of Christian terms, religious terms, but he's got such an outlook on humanity that is so beautiful. And I just really enjoyed this book a lot. Gilead. All right, I'll leave that chat there. My next chat is going to change directions quite a bit. I got a double feature. I've got book 10 and 11 of The Wheel of Time. I'm going to do these two together. These are the last two that Robert Jordan wrote himself before he passed away. This will be coming up soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.